For months, Washington's message sounded almost identical every single day. The SAVE Act is finished. It doesn't have the votes. The Senate will never allow it. Most political observers assumed the debate was over before it even reached the finish line. But then, something happened that almost nobody expected. Not only did Republicans revive the legislation, they found a completely different path to keep it alive. And even more surprising, 6 Democratic members of Congress broke with many in their party and voted in favor of it. That single moment immediately changed the political conversation. Was it simply a symbolic vote? Or does it reveal something much bigger happening beneath the surface in Washington? Because sometimes, one vote doesn't just pass a bill, it changes the strategy of everyone involved. Today, we're breaking down exactly what happened, why these votes matter, and what could happen next as the legislation moves through Congress. Before we begin, one important note. This issue has become one of the most debated topics in American politics. Supporters argue the legislation would strengthen election security by establishing new requirements related to voter eligibility. Opponents argue it could make voting more difficult for eligible citizens who face challenges obtaining required documentation. Our goal today isn't to tell you what to think. It's to explain what happened inside Congress, why lawmakers made the decisions they did, and why this legislative fight has suddenly become much more significant. Because over the past several months, many analysts believed this proposal had reached a dead end. The Senate appeared to present an almost impossible obstacle. Procedural rules made passage extremely difficult, and leaders from both parties publicly expressed confidence in very different outcomes. Then, within a short period on Capitol Hill, the political landscape shifted again. The House approved a new legislative package connected to the broader debate. Later, lawmakers also advanced another measure that kept the issue firmly in the spotlight. Suddenly, attention turned away from whether the proposal had political momentum and toward what would happen next in the Senate. That raises several important questions. Why did House leaders pursue this strategy? Why did a handful of Democrats support it? What makes this version different from earlier efforts? And could these developments actually change the bill's chances of becoming law? Those are the questions we'll answer throughout this video. But first, to understand why these recent votes attracted so much attention, we have to go back to where this fight began. Why the SAVE Act became one of Washington's biggest political battles. The debate over election laws has remained one of the most divisive issues in American politics since the 2020 election. Republican lawmakers have argued that stronger verification measures are necessary to increase public confidence in elections and ensure that only eligible U.S. citizens vote in federal contests. Many Democrats, however, have responded that existing federal law already prohibits non-citizens from voting in federal elections and that additional documentation requirements could unintentionally create barriers for eligible American voters. Those competing arguments have shaped nearly every discussion surrounding election legislation over the past several years. The SAVE Act emerged as one of the most prominent proposals in that debate. Supporters described it as a measure designed to standardize proof of citizenship requirements during voter registration and provide additional safeguards for election administration. Critics warned that implementation could prove difficult for some eligible voters who might not immediately have access to documents such as passports or birth certificates. Because of those sharply different perspectives, the legislation quickly became more than just another bill. It became a symbol. For Republicans, advancing the proposal demonstrated a commitment to election security. For Democrats opposing it, blocking the legislation represented protecting voter access. That political divide meant every vote attracted national attention. And once the House approved earlier versions of the legislation, the focus immediately shifted to the Senate. There, supporters faced a much steeper challenge. Senate rules, procedural requirements, and the need for broader bipartisan support made the path forward far more complicated than it had been in the House. For weeks, many observers believed that was where the effort would stall. But congressional leaders weren't finished looking for new strategies. And that brings us to the next chapter of the story, the strategy that suddenly put the legislation back at the center of Washington's agenda. As support for the original version of the legislation appeared to stall, House Republican leaders began looking for another path. Instead of simply bringing back the same proposal, they explored ways to incorporate election-related provisions into a broader legislative package. The idea was straightforward. If one route faced major procedural obstacles, perhaps a different legislative strategy could keep the issue alive. That's where the broader budget and reconciliation discussions entered the picture. Supporters argued that certain election-related funding provisions could be structured to meet the Senate's reconciliation rules, which allow qualifying budget measures to move with a simple majority, rather than the usual 60 votes required to overcome a filibuster. However, reconciliation comes with strict limits. Every provision must satisfy Senate budget rules, and the Senate parliamentarian reviews whether each section qualifies under those standards. In previous attempts, some proposals failed to clear that procedural hurdle. Rather than abandoning the effort, lawmakers revised portions of the package. One approach focused on providing federal grants to states that voluntarily adopted specific election administration standards, including voter identification or proof of citizenship measures. Supporters argued this incentive-based model had a stronger connection to federal spending, making it more likely to comply with reconciliation rules. Critics, however, questioned whether the revised language would ultimately survive the parliamentarians' review. At this stage, that question remains unresolved. So while supporters viewed the redesign as a strategic breakthrough, the proposal still faced important procedural tests before it could become law. In other words, the political battle had entered a new phase. Instead of debating only the policy itself, lawmakers were now debating how the policy could legally move through Congress. And then came another decision that drew even more attention. House leaders chose to connect the issue to one of the most closely watched pieces of legislation considered every year. Why the defense bill became part of the story. The National Defense Authorization Act, often called the NDAA, is one of Congress's annual must-pass bills. It sets policy for the Department of Defense and authorizes military programs and funding. While the exact contents can change from year to year, lawmakers from both parties generally view it as essential legislation. Because of its importance, amendments attached to the NDAA often receive intense public attention. During consideration of the defense bill, House lawmakers voted on an amendment related to the SAVE Act. That vote immediately became one of the day's biggest political stories. Why? Because several Democrats voted alongside Republicans. In today's highly polarized political environment, bipartisan votes on high-profile election issues are relatively uncommon. Whenever members cross party lines, political analysts immediately begin asking the same questions. Was this simply about the specific wording of the amendment? Was it influenced by the politics of individual districts? Or does it signal broader changes inside either party? Those questions don't have simple answers. Members of Congress often explain crossover votes by pointing to the priorities of their constituents, the details of the legislation, or broader concerns about governance. Each lawmaker may have reached a different conclusion for different reasons. That's why looking only at the vote total doesn't tell the whole story. Understanding why members voted the way they did requires examining their public statements, their districts, and their legislative priorities. Even so, the optics were significant. Supporters of the proposal argued that bipartisan support demonstrated growing momentum. Opponents countered that a small number of crossover votes did not necessarily indicate a broader shift in congressional opinion. Both interpretations quickly became part of the political debate. Meanwhile, attention shifted away from the House and toward the Senate. Because regardless of what happened in the House, the Senate would ultimately determine whether any version of the proposal could continue moving through the legislative process. And that brings us to perhaps the biggest political question of all. Why did these particular Democrats decide to vote the way they did? The Democrats who crossed party lines. Whenever members of Congress vote against the position favored by much of their own party, people naturally pay attention. Cross-party votes are often interpreted as signs of political independence, district-specific priorities, or strategic positioning ahead of future elections. In this case, several Democratic representatives supported the amendment related to the SAVE Act. Among those reported as voting in favor were Henry Cuellar of Texas, Don Davis of North Carolina, Jared Golden of Maine, Vicente Gonzalez of Texas, Adam Gray of California, and Marie Gluesenkamp Perez of Washington. These lawmakers represent very different parts of the country. Some serve competitive swing districts, others have built reputations for occasionally breaking with their party on selected issues. Political analysts often note that representatives from closely divided districts face unique pressures. Unlike lawmakers from heavily Democratic or Republican areas, they frequently balance competing expectations from voters with different political views. For some members, supporting a particular proposal may reflect local concerns. For others, it may reflect broader policy beliefs, and sometimes it may simply represent a judgment about one specific piece of legislation rather than a shift in overall political alignment. That's an important distinction. One vote rarely tells the complete story of a lawmaker's ideology. Members of Congress routinely support or oppose bills based on their specific language, procedural context, or negotiations taking place behind the scenes. Still, in politics, perception matters almost as much as policy. Supporters of the legislation quickly highlighted the bipartisan votes as evidence that the proposal was attracting broader support. Opponents emphasized that the overwhelming majority of Democratic lawmakers continued to oppose the measure. Both sides used the same vote to tell very different political stories. That is often how Washington works. The same event can produce completely different narratives depending on who's describing it. But the story didn't end there. Because the House vote was only one step in a much longer legislative journey, the proposal still faced major challenges before reaching the president's desk. If the House was the opening act, the Senate is where the outcome could ultimately be decided. And history shows that passing a bill through the House, even with bipartisan support, is only half the battle. The Senate operates under a different set of rules, different political dynamics, and different vote thresholds. That means legislation that moves quickly through one chamber can still face significant delays or even fail in the other. So what happens next? Once House-approved legislation reaches the Senate, senators must decide whether to take it up, amend it, or combine it with their own version. If the House and Senate pass different versions, they typically must resolve those differences before a final bill can be sent to the president. That process can be lengthy and highly negotiated. The procedural challenge. One of the biggest questions surrounding this proposal isn't simply whether senators support it. It's whether every provision complies with Senate rules. That's especially important if lawmakers try to move parts of the package through the budget reconciliation process. Reconciliation allows certain budget-related legislation to pass the Senate with a simple majority rather than the 60 votes usually needed to overcome a filibuster. But there's an important limitation. Only provisions that meet the Senate's reconciliation rules can remain in the bill. If a provision is determined to be primarily policy rather than budget-related, it may be removed during the Senate review process. That's why so much attention has focused on the role of the Senate parliamentarian. The parliamentarian is a nonpartisan official who advises the Senate on whether provisions comply with its procedural rules. Although the parliamentarian does not decide policy, those rulings can have a major impact on what ultimately stays in or comes out of a reconciliation package. For supporters of the proposal, this review represents one of the most significant hurdles still ahead. Even after a successful House vote, the legislative process is far from complete. The political calculations beyond the procedural questions, senators also face political ones. Some represent states where election security is a top concern among voters. Others represent states where expanding access to voting remains a central issue. As a result, every senator must weigh legal questions, policy arguments, constituent priorities, and political consequences before casting a vote. That is why Senate debates often become more detailed and sometimes more unpredictable than House debates. And with national attention focused on election policy ahead of future federal elections, every vote is likely to receive close public scrutiny. Why this matters beyond one bill. Regardless of where someone stands on the legislation itself, the broader debate reflects a larger question about how Congress approaches election law. Should more election standards be established at the federal level, or should states continue to retain broad authority over how they administer elections within existing constitutional and federal legal frameworks? Those questions extend well beyond a single bill. They touch on the balance between federal and state authority, election administration, and public confidence in the electoral process. That's why this debate continues to generate intense discussion inside Congress and across the country. Looking ahead for now, supporters see the recent House votes as evidence that the proposal still has momentum. Opponents argue that significant legislative and procedural obstacles remain before any version could become law. Both assessments can be true at the same time. Momentum in the House does not guarantee success in the Senate, and Senate hurdles do not necessarily prevent future negotiations. The legislative process is designed to test proposals through multiple stages, with opportunities for debate, amendment, and compromise. As the bill moves forward, those next stages may prove even more consequential than the votes that brought it this far. Politics often moves in unexpected ways. A proposal that appears stalled 1 month can return to the center of the national conversation the next. And that's exactly what has happened here. Whether you view the recent House votes as a political breakthrough or simply another step in a long legislative process, one fact is difficult to ignore. The debate over election policy is far from over. The next chapter now belongs to the Senate. If senators take up the legislation, several outcomes are possible. One possibility is that the Senate passes a version similar to what the House approved. Another is that senators amend the bill, sending it back to the House for further negotiations. A third possibility is that procedural rules prevent some provisions from advancing, forcing lawmakers to rethink their strategy once again. And as with many major pieces of legislation, negotiations behind closed doors could shape the final result just as much as the public debate. The political impact. Regardless of the legislative outcome, the votes themselves have already become part of the political narrative. Supporters of the measure argue that bipartisan votes in the House show the issue resonates beyond party lines. Opponents respond that isolated crossover votes do not necessarily reflect a broader shift in congressional opinion and emphasize that many lawmakers continue to oppose the proposal. Both parties are likely to use these developments in future speeches, campaign messages, and fundraising efforts. That is common in Washington. Major votes often become talking points long before the legislative process is complete. Why voters should pay attention. For many Americans, congressional procedure can seem complicated. Terms like reconciliation, filibuster, conference committee, and parliamentarian are not part of everyday conversation. But these procedural rules often determine whether legislation succeeds or fails. Understanding how Congress works helps explain why a bill can generate headlines for months before becoming law or never becoming law at all. That's why following the process is just as important as following the politics. The votes make headlines. The procedures often determine the outcome. The bigger picture election policy has remained one of the defining political issues of recent years. Supporters of stricter election safeguards argue they strengthen confidence in the voting system. Opponents argue reforms should protect election security while ensuring that eligible voters can participate without unnecessary barriers. Those competing priorities are likely to remain at the center of congressional debate for the foreseeable future. Whatever ultimately happens with this legislation, the broader conversation about election administration, federal authority, and voting access is unlikely to disappear. One House vote does not guarantee a law. One Senate debate does not settle a national issue. And one political moment rarely tells the entire story. But sometimes, a single series of votes signals that the conversation is changing. Whether these recent developments represent a lasting shift or simply another chapter in an ongoing legislative battle is something only the coming weeks and months will reveal. For now, all eyes remain on the Senate and on the next move Congress chooses to make. If you found this breakdown helpful, let us know your thoughts in the comments. We always encourage respectful discussion, even when opinions differ. And if you enjoy clear, fact-based coverage of major developments in Washington, consider subscribing so you don't miss our next analysis. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.